The sea doesn't give warnings, it just turns hostile. 1 second everything is under control, the next second control is a lie everyone is still pretending to believe. The system meant to keep death far away suddenly pulls it closer, sharper, louder. Orders are executed perfectly. That's what makes it terrifying. Nothing breaks the way it's supposed to. Nothing fails the way it should. Instead, the failure feels deliberate, almost practiced. Men look at their instruments, then at each other, waiting for reality to correct itself. It doesn't. The promise was simple: protection, dominance, safety through preparation. What they get is exposure. Silence stretches too long. Confidence drains faster than fear. And in that silence, a thought becomes impossible to ignore. This isn't the first time this could have happened. This moment feels rehearsed, like the ending of a story someone already read and chose not to rewrite. Because accidents feel sudden. This feels allowed. And once you realize that, you're forced to ask a question no Navy ever wants spoken out loud. If they knew this could happen, why were these men ever put here at all? The night tightens around the ship like a fist, and every sound suddenly feels too loud to be harmless. Boots thud along steel that vibrates with power and tension, men moving fast without running, trained not to look afraid even when their bodies already are. The horizon is empty until it isn't, until shapes emerge where there should be nothing but dark water and darker sky. Voices lower. Hands hover. Someone swallows hard and tastes metal. Whatever was supposed to happen next doesn't arrive on time. The rhythm they expect, detect, decide, deter, stutters, then slips completely out of sequence. A signal flashes where reassurance should be. A response hesitates where certainty was promised. The air feels thinner, like the ocean itself is holding its breath. Someone mutters that it'll correct itself in a second. It always does. Except this time, the second stretches. The deck officer looks again, closer now, willing the picture to make sense. It doesn't. Something is wrong, and everyone feels it before anyone says it. A contact moves in a way it shouldn't, closer than planned, bolder than anticipated, almost daring. The ship answers the way it was taught to answer, automatically, faithfully, trusting that the layers behind the decision are solid. They aren't. A warning tone bleeds into the background, not screaming, just persistent enough to crawl under the skin. Radios crackle with clipped phrases that sound calm but aren't. Someone asks for confirmation and doesn't like how long it takes to get one. The ocean reflects faint light off the hull, a reminder of how visible they really are. This was supposed to be a moment of control, a demonstration of distance and dominance. Instead, it feels intimate, uncomfortably close, like strangers breathing the same air. The crew waits for the invisible hand that's meant to push the threat back, to reassert the boundary everyone believes exists. It never comes. The realization lands quietly, then all at once, the system is responding, but not protecting. The assumption that danger would hesitate first evaporates. Eyes flick from screens to the dark outside, trying to reconcile training with instinct. A junior sailor whispers a question he shouldn't have to ask, and no one answers him. Another contact shifts. Another moment passes. The margin for error collapses into something you could measure with a heartbeat. This is the instant where doctrine stops being theory and becomes consequence. Sweat gathers under collars despite the cold. Someone grips a railing so hard their knuckles ache. The ship feels suddenly enormous and fragile at the same time. Commands are issued, acknowledged, executed, and still the distance keeps shrinking. Not because anyone froze. Not because anyone disobeyed. But because the thing everyone trusted to create space has done the opposite. The crew realizes they are visible, readable, predictable. The failure isn't loud. It's humiliating. It exposes them. A senior voice cuts through the noise, firm but tighter now, trying to reassert control over a situation that's already slipping. The words sound right. The effect doesn't follow. Somewhere deep inside the ship, someone understands before the rest do. This moment is going to be remembered, not as a close call, as the point where faith cracked. The tension peaks without exploding, a held breath that burns the lungs. And when the contact finally breaks away, Not because it was forced to, but because it chose to. The relief tastes wrong. Too thin. Too late. No one cheers. No one smiles. They just stand there, staring at instruments that swear everything worked as designed. The silence afterward is worse than the threat itself, because now they know what happens when reality tests the promise. And it failed them exactly when it mattered most. They were told this wouldn't happen. Not in so many words, but in every briefing, every rehearsal, every calm assurance baked into the routine. The story was clean and confident. Presence creates distance, preparation creates safety, and when a moment comes, the system responds faster than fear ever could. It was a promise repeated so often it stopped sounding like a promise and started feeling like physics, inevitable, unquestionable, immune to doubt. Sailors learned to move inside that certainty, to trust that layers they would never see were already working on their behalf. The expectation wasn't heroism. It was predictability. The idea that danger would blink first. That intent would be recognized early, answered smoothly, and pushed back without ever crossing into chaos. Everything about the posture said control, calm voices, measured movements, confidence that didn't need to be announced. This was how it was supposed to look when it worked. But what unfolded didn't match the picture they'd been given. Instead of distance, there was proximity. Instead of hesitation, there was boldness. The invisible boundary they believed in didn't hold. It thinned, then vanished. The contrast was jarring, like stepping onto a floor that was always supposed to be solid and feeling it flex under your weight. The official story said the system would shape the encounter, define the tempo, decide the outcome. The reality was the opposite. The encounter shaped them. The tempo slipped out of their hands. The outcome felt borrowed, temporary, dependent on choices made somewhere else. Confidence, once a constant background hum, became something fragile that had to be consciously maintained. The expectation was that the ship would be the calm center of the storm. Instead, it felt like the storm had found the center. Sailors who had trained for clarity were left navigating ambiguity, filling gaps with instinct because assurance never arrived. The betrayal wasn't dramatic or explosive. It was quiet, procedural, and deeply unsettling. Nothing looked broken on the surface. Screens glowed. Commands flowed. Checklists were followed. And yet the result contradicted the promise. The system had done what it was designed to do, and still failed to deliver what it was sold as. That contradiction is what lingers. Because if the official story can survive training, drills, and confidence building, but collapses the moment it's tested by reality, then the problem isn't luck. It's expectation. And once expectation breaks, trust goes with it. The sailors didn't lose faith because something went wrong. They lost faith because what went wrong was supposed to be impossible. The distance between what they were told and what they lived was no longer theoretical. It was measurable in seconds of silence, in meters of closing space, in the unsettling realization that certainty had been a performance all along. And if that performance could crack this easily, then the story everyone relied on was never as strong as it sounded. It happened as an exception, a strange alignment of circumstances that won't repeat itself. That's how these moments are usually framed. Unlucky, unusual, unlikely to happen again. But the sea has a way of repeating lessons when they aren't learned. Quietly elsewhere with different crews who have never heard the earlier story. Another watch, another night, another moment when confidence leans too heavily on assumptions. The details change, but the feeling doesn't. The same uneasy pause. The same expectation that the system will step in and reassert order. The same delay that stretches just long enough to be noticed. Sailors exchange looks they don't talk about later. Officers feel that flicker of doubt they push aside because the procedure says everything is normal. Each time, the boundary everyone believes in softens instead of hardening. Each time, the response feels reactive instead of commanding. These aren't identical scenes, but they rhyme in ways that make veterans uncomfortable. Different waters, different names on the roster, but the same core surprise. The realization that the margin for safety is thinner than advertised. One crew goes home unsettled but intact, telling themselves it was a close call. Another carries the memory forward, noticing the same hesitation during another patrol, another exercise, another real-world encounter. The pattern doesn't announce itself with alarms. It reveals itself through repetition, through the way relief always feels incomplete, through the way no one quite celebrates when the moment passes. The system keeps insisting it's working, and on paper it is. Yet the outcomes keep depending on restraint from the other side rather than control from this one. That's the thread that ties these incidents together. The danger doesn't retreat because it's forced to. It retreats because it chooses to. And that's not dominance, it's permission. Each repetition erodes something small but important. Confidence becomes cautious. Trust becomes conditional. Sailors start watching the gaps instead of the screens, listening for what isn't being said. The failures don't stack up in reports the way disasters do. They stack up in memory, in tone, in the shared understanding that something is off. By the third or fourth time, it's no longer deniable. This isn't a fluke. It's a behavior. A predictable weakness that keeps revealing itself under similar pressure. The horror of that realization isn't in what has happened so far, but in what it promises will happen again. Because patterns don't care who's on duty next. They don't care who believes hardest. They wait. And unless something changes, they repeat, quietly, patiently, until the cost is no longer just discomfort, but something far harder to walk away from. What makes the pattern unbearable is the realization that it wasn't invisible. The doubts existed long before the night everything tightened. They lived in cautious language, in phrases softened enough to survive meetings without causing friction. Notes were taken. Concerns were raised carefully, respectfully, framed as questions instead of accusations. Someone mentioned inconsistencies that didn't sit right. Someone else pointed out responses that arrived slower than expected, outcomes that relied too heavily on restraint from the other side. None of it sounded urgent on its own. That was the problem. Each warning was small enough to be postponed, reasonable enough to be explained away. Testing produced results that felt inconvenient rather than catastrophic. Reports suggested limitations that didn't align with the story everyone preferred to tell. The reaction was rarely denial. It was delay, a request for more data, a reminder that conditions weren't perfect, a reassurance that adjustments were coming. Meanwhile, operations continued. Sailors trained under the same assumptions. Missions went forward with the same confidence. The silence wasn't loud, but it was decisive. Every month that passed without change turned caution into complicity. The people closest to the risk weren't shown the full picture, not because someone lied outright, but because no one forced the issue into the open. The warnings became background noise, buried under schedules and priorities that felt more immediate. When moments like the inciting incident occurred, they were treated as anomalies rather than confirmations. The narrative stayed intact because acknowledging the alternative would have meant admitting that lives were being placed in avoidable danger. That admission never came. Instead, the system absorbed the warnings without acting on them, smoothing them into language that sounded responsible but changed nothing. By the time the failure revealed itself in full view, it didn't feel like a shock. It felt like recognition. The unease sailors couldn't quite name suddenly had a shape. This wasn't ignorance colliding with reality. It was reality catching up to a choice that had already been made, the choice to move forward despite uncertainty, to accept risk without fully owning it. That's what lingers after the moment passes. Not anger at a single decision, but the weight of knowing that the danger wasn't unknown. It was documented, discussed, and ultimately set aside. And once you see that, the failure itself almost feels secondary. Because mistakes happen. Warnings ignored are something else entirely. Behind every assumption, there are people standing watch, carrying the quiet weight of responsibility that never makes it into official language. Young sailors who still measure time by leave dates and hometown seasons. Older ones who had learned to read tension in the air before alarms ever sounded. They lived inside the system's promises, trusting that the risk they carried had meaning and limits. When those limits blurred, fear didn't arrive as panic. It arrived as focus, sharp and isolating. In cramped spaces, men listened to sounds they'd heard 1,000 times, now wondering which one would change first. Thoughts drifted, uninvited, to families who believed the ocean was safer than it felt in that moment. A father pictured a daughter asleep in a room he wouldn't see for months. A 20-year-old from a small town tried not to imagine his mother answering a knock at the door. No one said these things out loud. They didn't have to. The cost wasn't paid only in the instant of danger, but in what followed, the sleepless nights, the replaying of moments that didn't add up, the quiet erosion of trust in the protection they were told would be there. Some carried the experience forward into the next deployment, scanning the dark with a little less certainty, a little more tension in their shoulders. Others left the service with stories they struggled to explain because nothing officially went wrong. That made it harder. How do you justify fear when a report says success? How do you explain the weight of a moment that ended without impact but never really ended at all? The human cost isn't always marked by wreckage or loss that makes headlines. Sometimes it's measured in the way confidence changes shape, in the way trust becomes conditional. These sailors did their jobs exactly as asked. They followed orders, relied on what they were given, and faced the consequences when those assurances thinned. The risk they accepted was supposed to be calculated. What they felt was something closer to betrayal. And even when everyone went home alive, the price lingered, paid in doubt and strained silence, in the knowledge that next time, the margin might be even smaller. Because systems don't feel fear. People do. And they're the ones who carry it long after the ocean goes quiet. When the moment passed, nothing officially ended. There was no announcement, no reckoning, no line drawn under what had almost happened. The ocean returned to its calm routine, and the ship carried on as if continuity itself were proof that everything was fine. But silence is not the same as resolution. What lingered was the awareness that this wasn't a mystery solved. It was a warning deferred. The questions raised that night didn't disappear. They simply lost their audience. Somewhere, paperwork smoothed the edges. Language softened consequences. The story was reduced to professionalism under pressure, a successful navigation of a tense situation. That version is easier to live with. It doesn't demand change. But beneath it sits an uneasier truth. If the pattern was visible, if the warnings existed, if the risk was known and accepted, then this moment wasn't a test, it was a preview. And previews are dangerous because they suggest what comes next. The sailors went back to their duties carrying something heavier than fear, uncertainty about where the line actually is and who decides when it can be crossed. The institution moved forward, intact, confident, unchanged. That contrast is what haunts. Because history isn't shaped only by disasters, it's shaped by the near misses that teach the wrong lesson. If this was allowed once, it can be allowed again. And next time, restraint may not arrive on schedule. The ocean will still be indifferent. The systems will still insist they're working. The question isn't whether another moment like this will happen. It's whether, when it does, anyone will admit that the danger wasn't hidden at all, just quietly accepted.